Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant to bring you part 5 of my Zerg vs Tyranids matchup. This part will cover the numerical element of the matchup. To start though, I want to go over a couple issues that have been coming up in the comments. First, I've gotten a lot of comments about why I am talking about the Ultralisk as the biggest, baddest Zerg, and not the Brutalist, Omegalist, or Tarask, or a couple others. In this case, it's pretty simple, because they're really badly documented. If you look up Ultralisks, you can find all sorts of info about how they have bladed tusks with monomolecular edges that can cut through most stuff, that their armor is super tough, and all that wonderful information. If you look up Brutalisk or Omegalisk, you get that they exist, that they're bigger than Ultralisks, by how much, no idea, and that they show up in a couple levels, and that's basically it. At least with the Tarask, there's a little bit of additional information about how if you manage to actually down one, it just retreats into a cocoon and self-reses a little while later. There's a couple issues with this for my purposes. First, bigger than an Ultralisk doesn't mean anything, and I can't compare their relative sizes using in-game models because scaling in Starcraft is hilariously bad. Just look at the size of a Terran battlecruiser in-game, and then compare that to the size of Zerglings, and you'd think that a battlecruiser is about the size of a handful of Zerglings. Then you watch the cinematic, and the battlecruiser in the background that's crashing into the battleground city is the size of multiple skyscrapers combined. There's also the issue that how many of these bigger Zerg forms there actually are is really not explained at all. We're talking about full-fledged military conflict here, so if there are literal trillions of units engaged and fighting, and 2 of them are Gargantuan Brutalisks, or Megalisks, or Tarasks, they're not actually contributing much to the overall fight. So yeah, I can't quantify them in terms of abilities, and I can't tell how many of them there are beyond not many, so I'm not considering them as major contributors to this matchup. I'm not saying that they don't exist, just they're not going to be my point of comparison. The other issue that's come up a couple times is that I am off in my estimates on how fast Zerglings and Hormagaunts are. In this case, they are absolutely correct. I did a little more digging and found that some fans did some calcs based on in-game movement and size of the creature and all that, to figure out that Zerglings can actually run around 65 miles per hour, not 30 like I had suggested, so they're crazy fast. Meanwhile, Hormagaunts have a move speed of 10 inches with the ability to bounding leap for an additional 3 inches. Space Marines can move 6 inches, and canonically that means that they can move about 35 to 45 miles an hour, which means that doing normal movement, Hormagaunts can move between 58 and 75 miles per hour, and when doing their bounding leap, that increases to between 75 and 97 miles per hour. So yeah, turns out Hormagaunts are probably actually faster than Zerglings. But again, nobody is breaking the sound barrier here. The differences aren't that significant, so the difference here is, it matters, but it's not earth-shattering or going to tip the balance in one way or the other. All right, on to the numbers comparison. I'll start with the Zerg because I'll actually be able to get real-ish numbers. In StarCraft, there's a maximum population cap of 200, and each Zergling takes about half a population each, so you can have up to 400 of them at a time if you have made everything into Zerglings. And this is why I'm not relying upon in-game mechanics to do this comparison. I'll start by saying that definitive numbers are impossible to get, partially because they're constantly making more Zerg, but from what I can find, as of StarCraft 1, the Tiamat brood, the largest of the 6 at the time, had about 6.5 million Zerg, and all broods combined had around 12.1 million Zerg of a variety of types. So that's including all the Ultralisks down to the Zerglings and the Queens and everything else. As of StarCraft 2, there again aren't any definitive numbers regarding the Zerg out there, but I think it's safe to assume that they have more units than in StarCraft 1, since they've infested over 100 worlds by that point, and if there's only 1 million Zerg per world, that's a pretty sparse population, so how many there actually are is impossible to say, but I think it's pretty safe to say that there are billions of Zerg out there at that point. A more useful measure would be how many are in a given fleet, and we know that each Zerg fleet consists of a bunch of Leviathans, each of which can carry tens of thousands of Zerg strains. Unfortunately, we run again into the issue that we don't know how many Leviathans are in a given fleet, beyond the fact that they're rarely, if ever, by themselves. In the cinematic I've been using, which shows the Zerg fleet warping, there's only a handful of Leviathans and definitely not dozens or hundreds. So, for the sake of argument, I'll assume that a given Zerg fleet includes a dozen Leviathans, each carrying, let's say, 20,000 Zerg for a grand total of, let's just call it 240,000 Zerg of various types in a given invasion fleet. In addition, there's also one Overmind, or one Queen of Blades, depending on when in the timeline you're looking. I'll be referencing the Queen of Blades, or Karrian in this case, because she ends up being far more powerful than the Overmind, so she's the one I'll actually be using for the comparison. Commenter Noway also pointed out that Karrian has the ability in the game Zergling Reconstruction, which allows her to summon up to 200 Zerglings over the course of 10 minutes at the cost of 0 resources. I have a couple issues with this ability. First, everything I can dig up says that just the ability exists. Not how it works or if it actually costs something just not in-game, which immediately begs a lot of questions for me. Is Karrian having to expend a lot of psychic energy to do this? Is she actually resurrecting Zerglings, or is she just using her telekinetic powers to make a bunch of temporary meat puppets? Can she do this on other kinds of Zerg, or is she limited to Zerglings? Is the resource cost actually 0 for the Hive, or is there some kind of non-game mechanic cost associated with the ability? Is she actually limited to just 200 Zerg, or can she res more? All this makes me think that this is more of a game mechanic ability rather than a lore ability, since what she could really be doing here is anything from calling in reinforcements from somewhere else to just creating them ex nihilo from nothing, which would be a huge can of worms to unpack and would create a lot of questions about why she limits the ability to making puny Zerglings. Also, she can just create things out of nothing. Why doesn't she do that all the time? Keep in mind, this is a game where Terran Marines and siege tanks have unlimited ammo as well. That doesn't mean that they're just creating ammo. It means this is a game. Just because it's that way in the game doesn't mean that's actually how things work. Moving on to Tyranids. For starters, while Tyranids have been known to set up the odd colony here and there, why they do so is a mystery, and for the most part they just harvest biomatter to bolster up their fleet, and then move on to the next feeding spot. In lore, there are 3 hive fleets that have been encountered by the Imperium of Man, and these are thought to be basically expeditionary fleets, basically scouts, to precede the actual main bulk of Tyranid forces. These fleets are Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan. Hive Fleet Behemoth was the first encountered by the Imperium of Man and was ultimately destroyed by the Imperium, though remnant pieces managed to break off and get away. Each of these 3 fleets consist of hundreds of ships. Behemoth specifically had close to 1,000 ships. The question is, how many Tyranids are these ships actually carrying? The answer is tons, and also none. Tyranids don't carry troops from place to place. They carry biomatter, which they then use to create all the Tyranids they need, and when they're done eating everything they want off a planet, they eat all their soldiers as well and turn them back into biomatter. As I've mentioned in earlier sections, unless the biomatter is outright destroyed, the Tyranids don't really care about losses, since it's all just food that they'll get to sooner or later. All that said, we do get some information on how many Tyranids were used during certain battles. Specifically, in the Battle of Mcage, where the Imperium managed to drive back the Hive Fleet Behemoth, it stated that they managed to shoot down and destroy millions of mycetic spores, the means by which Tyranids land troops on the surface of worlds. They're basically drop pods. But millions more managed to reach the surface. These mycetic spores are large enough to carry Carnifex, which are essentially Tyranid tanks. So the same size pod can also carry dozens of Hormigons. But for the sake of argument, let's just say it's 12. Okay, let's be super conservative here. Let's say that 1 million mycetic spores made it to the surface and an additional 1 million were shot down. That means that we have an ultra-conservative, super low estimate of the equivalent of around 24 million Hormigons being involved in the initial assault, with plenty more being made over the course of the battle as more are dropped from orbit, and still more are being produced from spawning pools, which get set up as the Tyranids begin taking territory and harvesting biomatter. And they can harvest everything: flora, fauna, enemies themselves, microbial life, everything. As a reminder, that ultra-conservative estimate of 24 million Hormigons is about double the amount of units in a single wave of an invasion as there were in all Zerg broods everywhere combined as of StarCraft 1. And that's a absurdly conservative estimate. Combine those numbers, which are clearly closer to the hundreds of millions of units, with all the units produced over the course of the battle and such, both from the stores of biomatter and from gathered biomatter from both friendly and enemy losses, and you start getting a picture of how absolutely absurd the numbers of units we're talking about here really are. I'm linking in the description a video by the channel Invicta that goes into the true scale of a Tyranid invasion. It's far beyond what I'm actually describing here. So yeah, the whole thing with the Queen of Blades being able to summon an additional 200 units over the course of 10 minutes, assuming she's actually capable of doing so, and it's not just some game mechanic, that's really cool and it's really impressive, but you're in a matchup here of tens to hundreds of millions of Tyranids against a few 100,000, maybe a couple million Zerg. So who cares about the additional 200? Tyranids absolutely, hands down, definitively have the numbers advantage in this matchup. And that's all I've got for this section. Let me know in the comments if you think I've missed something significant. If you've seen the rest of this series so far, you know that I absolutely missed things during my research, so don't be shy about calling it out, just try to be polite. This is all in good fun, and until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.